I always believed that control was everything. Control over business, over finances, over life itself. I was taught that if you hold everything in your hands, nothing can slip through your fingers. For years, that belief served me well. At 42, I was the CEO of Caldwell Dynamics, one of the most powerful tech companies in the industry. I had built it from the ground up, turning a struggling startup into a billion-dollar empire. Investors trusted me, competitors feared me, and my employees respected me. In a world where success was defined by numbers and influence, I was untouchable. And then there was Vivian, my wife of 10 years, the perfect woman in every sense. Beautiful, poised, intelligent. She was the kind of woman men envied me for. We were the picture-perfect couple, the kind that graced magazine covers and attended exclusive charity events. Our marriage was built on appearances, on power, on the understanding that we were stronger together than apart. Or at least, that's what I thought. I loved her. I truly did. Maybe I wasn't the best husband. I worked too much, spent too many late nights in the office, always thinking about the next move, the next deal. But I had always thought she understood, that she supported me, that she was proud of what we built together. Lately, something had changed. She was distant, distracted. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, that I was just tired. But then I started noticing things. The way she smiled at me felt rehearsed, like a performance. The way she pulled away when I reached for her. The way she guarded her phone, always turning the screen away from me. I asked her once, casually, if something was wrong. She laughed, kissed me on the cheek, and told me not to be silly. But it was there. The sinking feeling. I wasn't a man who acted on emotions. I built my company by reading people, by understanding their motives, by staying 5 steps ahead. And yet, I had no idea what was happening in my own house. I started paying more attention. I noticed the late-night text messages, the way she was constantly checking her reflection before she left the house. She was always busy, always had somewhere to be. Charity events, she called them. Dinners with her friends. But when I asked her which friends, she hesitated. Then, there was the money. Vivian never needed to worry about finances. I made sure of that. But suddenly, there were unusual charges. Hotel stays, luxury gifts, high-end restaurants I had never been to. I didn't want to believe it, but I wasn't a fool. I hired Marcus Vance, a private investigator known for his discretion. I told myself it was just to put my mind at ease, that maybe I was being paranoid. A week later, he gave me the answer. A file. Not thick, but heavy. I held it in my hands for a long time before opening it. Vivian. With another man. Not just any man. Damian Holt, an artist. Younger than me, full of the kind of arrogance that makes women think they found something special. They were together at hotels, private getaways, secret dinners. There were photos, text messages, proof. I stared at it for a long time, unable to move. I wasn't an emotional man. I prided myself on being rational, on never losing control. But something about seeing it, undeniable, unchangeable, made my stomach drop. I had built an empire, and somehow, I had lost my own wife. I thought about confronting her, about throwing the file onto the dinner table and demanding answers. But what would be the point? I already knew the truth. Instead, I sat in my office that night, whiskey in hand, staring at the skyline. I had spent my whole life making the right moves, building something that no one could take away from me. But she had. She had taken something I thought was unshakable. I wanted to hate her, but all I could feel was the slow, quiet pain of realizing that the woman I loved had stopped loving me. Maybe a long time ago. Maybe I had just been too blind to see it. I could have yelled. I could have made a scene, thrown her out, exposed her for what she had done. But what good would that do? It wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't take back the nights she had spent in another man's arms. So instead, I made a decision. If Vivian wanted to leave, I would let her. But I wouldn't let her walk away unscathed. No confrontation, no screaming, no broken glass. Just cold, calculated consequences. I called my lawyer and had every joint account frozen, every credit card shut down, every asset in her name pulled back into mine. By the time she realized what had happened, she would have nothing but the clothes on her back. Then, I called Marcus again. I wanted to know everything about Damien Holt. His background, his finances, his weaknesses. If he thought he could take my wife, he would soon realize he was nothing more than a distraction, a plaything. He would lose everything. And Vivian? She thought she had made a choice. She had no idea that I had already made mine. I watched her from across the room that evening, trying to remember when it all changed. She stood by the fireplace, glass of wine in one hand, phone in the other, her lips slightly parted in a soft smile, one I hadn't seen in a long time. Not from her. Not for me. I used to be the reason for that smile. Once, I would come home late from work, exhausted, only to find her waiting for me with a warm kiss and a playful remark about my obsession with the company. Once, she would curl up beside me in bed, tracing lazy circles on my arm as she talked about her day, as if nothing in the world mattered more than sharing that moment with me. Now she barely looked up. The warmth was gone, replaced with something distant, indifferent. She had mastered the art of making me feel like a ghost in my own home. I used to tell myself it was just stress, that I was working too much, that I wasn't paying enough attention to her. But it wasn't that. It had never been that. I cleared my throat. "You're quiet tonight." She glanced up, startled, as if she had forgotten I was there. I forced a small smile. "You've been on your phone for the last 20 minutes. She hesitated for half a second. So small a pause that, once, I wouldn't have even noticed it. But I had learned to read her too well. Then she slipped the phone into the pocket of her silk robe. "Just making plans. I have a charity gala this weekend." Another gala. Another night spent drinking expensive champagne and pretending to care about causes that didn't matter. Another excuse. I wanted to ask her who she had been texting. I wanted to ask her if she still loved me. Instead, I took a sip of my drink and said nothing. She walked over to the couch, sitting across from me. For a moment, I thought she might reach for my hand. That maybe this night, this moment, could be different. But she only leaned back against the cushions and let out a small sigh. "I think we should take a trip," she said, staring at the ceiling. "Just the two of us. Get away from all the stress. A vacation. The last time we had taken one, she spent half of it on her phone. Distracted. Distant. She didn't want to fix this. She wanted to distract me." I set my glass down, my fingers tightening around the rim. "Where would we go?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Paris?" That hurt, because I knew what Paris meant to her. It was where she had met him, Damien Holt. I had never said his name out loud, had never spoken of him, never acknowledged what I knew. But I knew, and she knew that I knew. And yet, she still sat across from me, smiling, pretending. I exhaled slowly. "I don't think I have time for that." She frowned. "Ethan, you always put work first." I met her gaze, something sharp twisting in my chest. "And you don't?" A flicker of something passed across her face. Guilt? Maybe. Or maybe just frustration that I wasn't playing along. She shook her head and stood up. "Forget it." I watched her leave the room, her phone already back in her hand, fingers tapping away. I let out a slow breath. I had spent my life making smart decisions. Calculated, precise, unemotional. I built my business from nothing, turned it into something unstoppable. I made all the right moves. And yet, here I was, sitting in my own home, knowing my wife was in love with someone else, knowing I had already lost. I could have confronted her, could have demanded answers, asked her why, screamed, broken things, begged her to tell me the truth. But none of that would change what had already happened. So I did what I had always done. I made a plan. The next morning, I woke up early. She was still asleep beside me, her breathing soft, peaceful. I used to love watching her sleep. Now all I saw was a stranger. I got dressed, left quietly, and drove to my office. Marcus Vance was already there when I arrived, sitting in the chair across from my desk, an envelope resting on his lap. He looked at me carefully, like he was trying to figure out what kind of man I was about to be. I gestured toward the envelope. "That for me?" He nodded, sliding it across the desk. I opened it slowly, even though I already knew what was inside. Photos, text messages, receipts, the final, undeniable proof. Vivian and him. I felt nothing. Not anger. Not shock. Just a strange, dull emptiness. Marcus cleared his throat. What do you want to do? I closed the file, exhaled. How much does he have? Marcus smirked. He's broke. Living off rich women who think he's the next big thing. I nodded. Freeze every account that has her name on it. Credit cards, joint accounts, investments. I want her locked out of everything before the day is over. Marcus whistled low. Cold. I leaned back in my chair. If she wants him, she can have him. I took a slow breath, exhaling through my nose. She just won't have me. When I got home that night, she was waiting for me. Ethan, she started, her voice careful. I loosened my tie, set my briefcase down. Yes? She held up her phone. My cards aren't working. I nodded. She frowned. Did you? I tilted my head, studying her like a puzzle I had already solved. I did. Her face paled. Why? I took my time, unbuttoning the cuffs of my shirt, rolling them up. Because I don't fund infidelity, Vivian. Her lips parted slightly, like she wanted to say something. But what could she say? That I was wrong? That it wasn't what it looked like? I had seen the proof. I had watched her lie to me in real time. There was no excuse, no explanation that would undo what she had done. She swallowed hard. Ethan, please. A plea. A quiet, desperate one. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something real. Not anger. Not vengeance. Just the deep, aching sadness of realizing that I had spent years loving someone who had stopped loving me a long time ago. I pulled an envelope from my pocket and placed it on the table between us. She stared at it. What is this? Divorce papers. Her breath caught. Ethan. I met her gaze, steady, calm. Pack your things, Vivian. You're leaving tomorrow. She blinked, looking almost like she wanted to fight, like she wanted to protest. But there was nothing left to say, nothing left to save. I turned and walked out of the room. I didn't slam the door. I didn't need to. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet movements from the other room. The sound of drawers opening and closing, the zip of a suitcase, the hesitation in her steps. Vivian was packing. She thought I was asleep. I wasn't. I could hear her breath hitch every now and then, the way her movements slowed like she was waiting for something. Maybe waiting for me to get up, to stop her, to say something. But I didn't. I kept my eyes on the ceiling, my hands resting on my chest, breathing evenly. She could have woken me up. She could have sat down beside me, told me the truth, begged me to listen. But she didn't. By the time the sun rose, she was gone. The only thing left of her was the faint trace of her perfume on the pillow beside me. I lay there for a few minutes, unmoving. It was done. I had wanted this. I had planned for this. Then why did I feel like I had lost something I wasn't ready to let go of? I forced myself to get up. The house was silent, too silent. The kind of silence that made you realize how much space someone used to take up in your life. Her perfume still lingered faintly in the hallway. Her coffee mug was still on the kitchen counter. She had left behind the things that didn't matter. Clothes, jewelry, even some of the gifts I had given her over the years. But she had taken the things that did. The Polaroid photo from our first trip to Italy. The silk robe she wore every morning. The diamond necklace I had given her on our 5th anniversary. The one she had once said she'd never take off. I exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over my face. It shouldn't matter. She had made her choice. And I had made mine. I poured myself a coffee, the same way I did every morning, the routine grounding me. The warmth of the cup in my hands felt like the only real thing in this house now. I took a slow sip, staring out the window. Vivian was gone. Now, it was Damien's turn. By noon, I was at my office. Marcus was already there, sitting in the chair across from my desk, watching me carefully. She's out, he said. I nodded, setting my briefcase down. I know. He studied me for a moment. How do you feel? I let out a breath, adjusting my watch. Like I did what needed to be done. Marcus didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. Instead, he dropped a thick folder onto my desk. He's in deeper than we thought, he said. I opened it, scanning the documents inside. Bank statements, rental agreements, court records. Debt? I asked. Marcus smirked. And a lot of it. Your boy has been borrowing from some very dangerous people. I flipped through the pages, taking in the numbers, the unpaid loans, the mounting interest. He needs her money, I murmured. Marcus nodded. And you just cut him off. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling. It wasn't enough. I didn't just want Damien to suffer financially. I wanted him to understand what it felt like to have something ripped away from him. To wake up one day and realize that everything he had counted on, everything he had built his world around, was gone. I wanted him to feel what I had felt. That evening, I went to the one place I knew Damien would be. A small, overpriced art gallery downtown, filled with people who liked to pretend they understood the meaning behind random paint splatters. I stepped inside, adjusting the cuffs of my jacket. The air smelled of red wine and expensive perfume. Conversations buzzed around me, murmured observations about color palettes and brush strokes. And then I spotted him. Damien stood near one of his paintings, drink in hand, his posture relaxed. He was talking to a small group of admirers, his smile easy, charming. For a moment, I just watched. I had wondered what kind of man my wife had chosen over me. Now I had my answer. He was soft, not in the way of kindness or warmth, but in the way of men who had never fought for anything real. The kind of man who floated through life, charming his way into the lives of women who mistook his lack of ambition for depth. He didn't notice me at first, not until I stepped a little closer. His eyes flicked up, meeting mine. The second he saw me, I saw the shift. The confidence wavered. His grip on his drink tightened. He knew who I was. Good. I took a slow sip of my own drink. Beautiful work. He swallowed hard. Thank you. I tilted my head toward the painting beside him. It's yours? He hesitated, then nodded. Yes. I turned my gaze to the canvas, pretending to examine it. It was messy, chaotic, lacking precision, just like him. What's it about? I asked. He cleared his throat. It's, about rebirth. Reinvention. I smirked. Interesting. See, I look at it and I see something else. His jaw tightened. Yeah. I met his gaze. I see desperation. A flicker of panic crossed his face. I took a step closer. I know who you are, Holt, and I know what you are. He exhaled sharply, his fingers twitching at his side. I smiled, slow and deliberate. Do you know what happens when a man like me turns his attention to a man like you? He didn't answer. I leaned in slightly, just enough so that only he could hear. You stop existing. A small bead of sweat formed on his temple. I straightened, giving him one last glance before turning away. Let him wonder. Let him fear. Let him feel what it's like to be powerless. By the time I left the gallery, I already knew how this would end. He was going to lose everything, and he wasn't going to see it coming. I didn't expect him to run so quickly. The morning after our conversation, Damien Holt vanished. Marcus called me as soon as he found out. He's gone, he said, his voice laced with amusement. Checked out of his apartment overnight. Canceled his gallery show next week. Even his social media is quiet. I leaned back in my chair, watching the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. Where did he go? Don't know yet, but I have people looking. Of course he ran. I had seen the way his hands trembled when I spoke to him, the way his mouth had gone dry. He was a man used to seducing, not surviving. And now he was learning that charm only worked when the people around you let it. I should have felt satisfied, but I didn't. Not yet. Find him, I said simply, and keep me updated. Marcus chuckled. This is personal for you, isn't it? I didn't answer. It wasn't about Vivian anymore. Maybe it never had been. It was about the way I had spent years believing my life was secure, only to realize how easily someone could slip into it, steal from it, take what was mine. Damien had played his little game. Now, it was my turn. 2 days passed before Marcus called me again. Got him, he said, sounding pleased with himself. San Diego. Checked into some low-budget hotel under an alias. Didn't do a great job covering his tracks, though. I guess panic does that to a man. I exhaled slowly, closing my laptop. Good. Want me to pay him a visit? No, I stood, adjusting my tie. I'll handle this myself. Marcus let out a low whistle. Damn, you really want this guy to suffer? I didn't respond. It wasn't about suffering. It was about consequences. I took a late flight, arriving in San Diego well past midnight. The hotel was exactly what I expected. Run down, dimly lit, the kind of place where people paid in cash and didn't ask questions. I walked into the lobby, spotting the night clerk half asleep at the desk. He barely looked up as I leaned against the counter. I'm looking for a friend, I said, sliding $100 bill across the surface. Checked in under the name Liam Parker. The clerk blinked at the cash, then at me. He pocketed the bill and nodded. Room 214. I took the stairs 2 at a time. The hallway smelled like old carpet and cheap air freshener. I stopped in front of room 214, listening. Silence. I knocked once. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. A muffled curse, followed by shuffling footsteps. Then the door cracked open just enough for me to see one bloodshot eye staring at me. The second he realized who I was, he tried to slam the door shut. I caught it with my foot, pushing forward. He stumbled back, panic flashing across his face. He was a mess, unshaven, hair disheveled, wearing a wrinkled t-shirt that looked like it hadn't been washed in days. He was already unraveling. Good. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. Damien's breathing was shallow, his hands shaking. What the fuck do you want? I took a slow look around. The room was pathetic. Half-empty bottles of cheap liquor on the nightstand, clothes strewn across the floor, an untouched bag of fast food on the desk. I turned my gaze back to him. I warned you. He licked his lips, swallowing hard. Listen, I don't want any trouble, okay? I tilted my head. No? That's interesting. Because you had no problem causing trouble when you decided to sleep my wife? His face went pale. It wasn't like that. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. No? Then explain it to me. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. I took a step closer. He took one back. You thought you could walk into my life, take something that belonged to me, and there wouldn't be consequences? I asked. You thought you were clever? He shook his head quickly. No, I never wanted to hurt anyone. I didn't. I exhaled sharply. Let me tell you what's about to happen, Damien. He froze. You're going to leave, I said. Not just this city. Not just this state. You're going to disappear. You're going to find some little hole in the world to crawl into, and you're going to stay there. His hands curled into fists. Or what? I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice. Or I ruin you. He swallowed hard. I own you now, I continued, my tone even. I know where you live. I know who you owe money to. I know every lie you've ever told, every scam you've ever pulled. And if you even breathe in my direction again, I will make sure the world knows it too. His eyes darted to the door, calculating. I smirked. Go ahead. Run. See how far you get. He didn't move. I want you gone by tomorrow, I said. No trace. No second chances. Damien clenched his jaw, his body trembling slightly. And if I don't? I stared at him for a long moment, letting the silence stretch. Then I stepped closer, lowered my voice to barely a whisper. You won't like the answer. His Adam's apple bobbed. I turned toward the door, pausing with my hand on the handle. One more thing. He looked up, his eyes filled with something close to dread. Tell me, I said, was she worth it? His lips parted, but no sound came out. I didn't wait for an answer. I walked out, letting the door slam behind me. By the time I boarded my flight home, Damien Holt was gone. I didn't need Marcus to confirm it, but he did anyway. He booked a one-way ticket to Mexico, he said over the phone, amusement lacing his voice. Seems like he got the message. Good. And Vivian? I took a slow sip of my coffee. I don't care. And for the first time, I meant it. She wasn't my problem anymore. She wasn't anything anymore. I leaned back in my seat, closing my eyes as the plane took off. Damien was gone. Vivian was gone. And I was still here. Still standing. And I always would be. I stepped off the plane, inhaling the crisp evening air as I walked through the private terminal. The city skyline stretched before me, sharp and unshaken. I had come back to the same life, the same empire, but something was different. There was no war left to fight. Vivian was gone. Damien was nothing. And yet, as I slid into the waiting car, a strange emptiness settled in my chest. Marcus was already there, waiting. He looked up from his phone as I entered, nodding. "You look like a man who got exactly what he wanted." I smirked. "I did." He studied me for a moment. "And yet, you don't look happy about it." I exhaled through my nose, looking out the window as the driver pulled away from the airport. Happiness was never the goal. He snorted. "Yeah, well, you got that right." We rode in silence for a few minutes, the city lights blurring past. Then Marcus tapped his phone against his knee and glanced at me. "What do you want to do about Monroe?" Silas Monroe, the only loose end left. While I had been dealing with Vivian and Damien, Monroe had been circling like a vulture, waiting for the right moment to strike. He wanted my company, my empire. I wasn't going to let that happen. I leaned back, adjusting my cufflinks. "How much leverage do we have on him?" Marcus smirked, unlocking his phone and scrolling through something. "More than enough." He turned the screen toward me. "His company's liquidity is weaker than he's letting on. If the wrong people found out, his stock would tank overnight." I took the phone, scanning the data. "And his investors?" Getting nervous. "A few of them are already sniffing around, looking for a way out. A little push, and they'll jump ship." I let out a slow breath, handing the phone back. Monroe thought he could outmaneuver me. He thought I had been too distracted to notice his moves. He had no idea that I had been waiting for this moment all along. I turned to Marcus. "Set the trap." The next morning, I walked into Caldwell Dynamics like nothing had happened. Like my wife hadn't just walked out of my life. Like I hadn't just made a man disappear. Like I wasn't about to dismantle Silas Monroe piece by piece. The office was buzzing with energy. Employees moving quickly, phones ringing, deals being made. It was a machine, and I was the one who kept it running. I stepped into my private elevator, the doors sliding shut behind me. My assistant, Claire, was already inside, holding a tablet. "Morning, Mr. Caldwell," she said, professional as ever. "Your 9 o'clock meeting with the board is confirmed. The press is still asking for a statement regarding your divorce, but I've kept them at bay for now." I exhaled, rolling my shoulders. "Let them speculate." She nodded. "And Monroe?" I adjusted my watch, my expression unreadable. "By tonight, he won't have a company left to run." Claire didn't react. She had worked for me long enough to know what that meant. By the time I stepped into my office, everything was already in motion. I sat at my desk, steepling my fingers as I watched the information roll in. Leaked financial documents, rumors of a sell-off, a whisper in the right ears, and suddenly Monroe Tech's investors were panicking. Stocks don't crash in a day, unless someone gives them a reason to. By noon, the damage was done. Silas called me at exactly 12:14 p.m. I answered on the third ring. "Monroe?" His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the edge of panic beneath it. "You son of a bitch." I smiled slightly, leaning back in my chair. "Something wrong?" "You know damn well what's wrong," he snapped. "You think I don't see your fingerprints all over this? You think I don't know what you're doing?" I swirled the whiskey in my glass, amused. "What am I doing, exactly?" A sharp breath on the other end of the line. "You're trying to bury me." I let the silence stretch. Then I said, calmly, "No, Silas. I'm not trying to bury you." A long pause. He understood. I was already shoveling the dirt. He let out a bitter laugh. "You really don't stop, do you?" "No," I said simply. Another pause. Then, softer, more calculated. "What do you want?" There it was. The shift. The moment a man realizes he's lost. I took a slow sip of my drink. "Your company. What's left of it?" Silas laughed again, but this time it was emptier. "You want me to sell to you?" "I want you to hand it over." A sharp inhale. "You can't be serious." "I'm always serious." A long silence. Then, finally, he muttered, "If I say no?" I exhaled slowly, letting my words sink in. "You won't have to, because by tomorrow, there wouldn't be anything left of his empire to fight for." Another pause. Then, quietly, he said, You really are a ruthless bastard, aren't you? I didn't answer. He sighed. Fine. Let's talk. I ended the call. Game over. That night, I stood in my penthouse, overlooking the city. My city. I had one. Vivian was gone. Damien was nothing. Silas Monroe was about to sign away the last thing he had left. I had everything I had fought for. And yet, as I stood there, whiskey in hand, staring at the skyline, I felt something I hadn't expected. A hollow space inside me. Winning had always been the goal. So why did it feel like I had lost something along the way? I turned away from the window, setting my glass down. It didn't matter. Tomorrow was another day, and I had an empire to run. I should have felt victorious. Everything I had set out to do, I had done. Vivian was gone. Damien was ruined. Monroe had surrendered before I could crush him completely. My company was stronger than ever. My empire was intact, untouchable. And yet, I sat in my office, staring at the city lights through the window, feeling absolutely nothing. No rush of triumph. No satisfaction. Just a strange, hollow quiet inside my chest. I had spent so long chasing this moment, orchestrating every move, making sure I came out on top. But now that I was here, it felt like I was standing in an empty room, waiting for something that wasn't coming. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing a hand over my face. Maybe I had been too focused on the fight to consider what came after. Maybe I thought once I won, everything would fall into place. Instead, it felt like I had burned down a house just to prove I could survive the fire. A soft knock at the door broke my thoughts. It was late, too late for anyone to still be here. Come in, I said, my voice rougher than I expected. The door opened, and to my surprise, Claire stepped inside. She never stayed this late. She had a life outside of this place, unlike me. But there she was, standing in the dim light of my office, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite place. I saw the light on, she said softly. I nodded, exhaling. Couldn't sleep. She took a few steps closer. Long day. I let out a humorless chuckle. Long month. She hesitated, then sat down in the chair across from me. You won, she said simply. I smirked, shaking my head. That's what they tell me. She studied me for a moment. Then why do you look like someone who lost? I glanced back at the window, watching the headlights move through the streets below. Because I don't know what comes next. The words surprised me even as I said them. Claire tilted her head slightly. You never think about the future? I shrugged. I always thought winning was the future. Her expression softened. And now? Now I wasn't sure. I had spent so much time making sure no one who wronged me got away with it. So much time looking backward, fixing what had been broken, making sure no one could ever take from me again. But I had never asked myself what I was running toward. Maybe I wasn't running toward anything at all. I exhaled slowly, looking at Claire. Not just seeing her as my assistant, the person who managed my meetings, handled my chaos, kept my life in order, but seeing her. She had been here for years. Through everything. She had seen the man I used to be and the one I had become. And she was still here. Not out of obligation. Not because I was paying her to be. But because, for some reason, she still cared. Ethan, she said quietly, searching my face. What now? The question lingered in the air between us. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't have an answer. I let out a breath, feeling something shift inside me. I guess, I said slowly, we find out.